Good evening. My name is BJ Ward. I'm the director of the Visiting Authors Series at Warren Community College and one of your two co-hosts for this special evening. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the life and the wealth of poetry that Stephen Dunn has left us. Stephen died on June 24th this year, exactly on his 82nd birthday. He left behind not only his poems, but a host of friends, readers, and colleagues, 25 of whom are here tonight to celebrate his work. First, I must thank some funding entities. Gratitude to the Warren County Division of Cultural and Heritage Affairs for the grant that allows us to run all of these Visiting Authors Series events, as well as to the administration of Warren Community College for its support of the series. Tonight, I would also like to thank Murphy Writing of Stockton University for being such a great partner in putting on this event. Tonight, you will hear from some of Stephen's friends, some of his colleagues, and some of his former students. All of them readers who admire Stephen's work deeply. Each participant has been invited to choose one of Stephen's poems that is meaningful to her or him. Each has been invited to speak briefly, if he or she wishes, about Stephen, and then to launch into the poem. Tonight's focus, a celebration of the poetry of Stephen Dunn. For those watching this live, we will take a 5-minute break halfway through the event. It is my pleasure to introduce Peter E. Murphy, my co-host this evening and the MC for the second half of tonight's event. He will read tonight's first poem. He is the founder of Murphy Writing of Stockton University. His most recent book is the memoir Looking for Thelma, which received the Wilk Prize for creative nonfiction. Peter E. Murphy.
Thank you, BJ, for organizing this and doing, as I said, doing all of the heavy lifting. And thank you all of our other poets and friends of Stephen's and those of you who are listening. I'm not going to speak for 2 minutes. I just want to say that if Stephen were watching this, he'd probably be rather watching a game. So I'm not going to talk much about him. I'm not going to say anything about him, except that he would be joyful. And so despite the poem I'm about to read, I'd like to remember Stephen with joy. This is a postmortem guide, one. He wrote 2 of them. For my eulogist in advance, 1999. Do not praise me for my exceptional serenity. Can't you see I've turned away from the large excitements and have accepted all the troubles? Go down to the old cemetery. You'll see there's nothing definitive to be said. The dead were once all kinds, boundary breakers and scalawags, martyrs of the flesh, and so many dumb bunnies of duty unbearably nice. I've been a little of each. And please, resist the temptation of speaking about virtue. The seldom tempted are too fond of that word, the small-spirited, the unburdened. Know that I've admired in others only the fraught straining to be good. Adam's my man, and Eve's not to blame. He bit in, it made no sense to stop. Still, for accuracy's sake, you might say I've often stopped, that I rarely went as far as I dreamed. And since you know my hardships, understand they're mere bump and setback against history's horror. Remind those seated, perhaps weeping, how obscene it is for some of us to complain. Tell them at the end, I had no need for God, who had become just a story I once loved, one of many with concealments and late-night rescues, high sentence and pomp. The truth is, I've learned to live without hope as well as I could, almost happily, in the despoiled and radiant now. You who are one of them, say that I love my companions most of all. In all sincerity, say that they provided a better way to be alone.
Thank you, Peter Murphy. Our next reader is Maxine Petroni. She holds the MFA in poetry from New York University, where she was the Teachers and Writers Fellow. She teaches at Stockton University.
Hi there. Thank you, BJ and Peter, for putting this together. I'd like to start with a letter I wrote to Stephen for his 82nd birthday. Dear Stephen, my teacher, my mentor, you, the critical eye, the coach, you, the guide through the underworld of poems, the reason I transferred colleges. If I want to do this for life, I go to him. You, your lessons, every possibility. The man who opens each workshop with a poem, the awe of the first line, the silence after the final, the students in the room leaning closer. You, the portal who brings that to us. You who saw something greater in me than I could see for myself. You, the steadfast, the love, the wisdom and stories, the respect for what poetry is to yourself, to others, like listening in on a holy conversation. You, whatever he's doing, I want to do that, who can make the audience laugh and cry in the same couplet, the quick turn of a master, the wit and empathy. You, a man who has been there before, the scrapper, the scallywag, the grace and the poise. You who quit one job only to never quit another. You who changed so many lives, especially this one, especially this one. To you from me forever with love. And I'm going to read his poem called The Vanishings. One day it will vanish, how you felt when you were overwhelmed by her, soaping each other in the shower, or when you heard the news of his death there in the T-Bone Diner on Queens Boulevard, amid the shouts of short order cooks, Armenian, oblivious. One day one thing and then a dear other will blur, and though they won't be lost, they won't mean as much. That motorcycle ride on the dirt road to the deserted beach near Cadiz, the Guardia mistaking you for a drug runner, his machine gun in your belly. Already history now, merely your history, which means everything to you. You strained to bring back your mother's face and full body before her illness, the arc and tenor of family dinners, the mysteries of radio, and Charlie Collins, 8 years old, inviting you to his house to see the largest turd that had ever come from him unflushed. One day, there'll be almost nothing except what you've written down, then only what you've written down well, then little of that. The March on Washington in '68, where you hope to change the world and meet beautiful, sensitive women, is choreography now. Cops on horses, everyone backing off, stepping forward. The exam you stole and put back unseen has become one of your stories, overtold, tainted with charm. All of it, anyway, will go way of the icebergs come summer, the small chunks floating in the Adriatic until they're only water, pure, and someone taking sad pride that he can swim in it numbly. For you, though, loss, almost painless, that senior prom at the Latin Quarter, Count Basie and Sarah Vaughan, and you just interested in your date's cleavage and staying out all night at Jones Beach, the small dune fires fueled by driftwood. You can't remember a riff or a song, and your date's a woman now, married, has had sex as you have some few thousand times. Good sex and forgettable sex, even boring sex. Oh, you never could have imagined back then, with the waves crashing, what the body could erase. It's vanishing as you speak, the soul grit, the story fodder. Everything you retrieve is your past. Everything you let go goes to memory's outbox, open on all sides, in cahoots with thin air. The jobs you didn't get vanish like scabs. Her goodbye, causing the phone to slip from your hand, doesn't hurt anymore. Too much doesn't hurt anymore. Not even that hint of your father ghost thumping on your roof in Spain hurts anymore. You understand and therefore hate, because you hate the passivity of understanding. that your worst rage and finest private gesture will flatten and collapse into history, become invisible like defeats inside houses. Then something happens, it is happening, which won't vanish fast enough. Your voice fails, chokes to silence. Hurt, how could you have forgotten, hurts. Every other truth in the world, out of respect, slides over, makes room for its superior.
Thank you, Maxine. Our next reader is Laura McCullough. Laura's most recent book of poetry is Women and Other Hostages, released this year. She is also the editor of the only book of essays exclusively about Stephen Dunn's work. It's called The Room and the World, Essays on Stephen Dunn, released by Syracuse University Press. Laura McCullough.
What I'd like to do is to reference that book, actually, which I was very honored to be able to edit. And one of the contributors is not with us tonight, and all of you know him, who was very important in Stephen's life. I'd like to read just one paragraph from Kurt Brown's Scattered Notes on a Coherent Poet. Desire is Dunn's main subject, sexual desire to be sure, but all forms and manifestations of desire in general. He's not a Buddhist about it, but he knows that desire is the root cause, the motivation, the prime mover of almost all human action and consequent experience. The trick is not to deceive ourselves about our desires, which his poems state in one way or another over and over again. The soul, the spirit, the ego is not quiescent but tossed on a sea of longing. What we choose and what we do about choosing it is all. Kurt Brown. I'll be reading The Afterlife. There have been times I've thought worms might be beneficent, speeding up as they do the dissolution of the body. I've imagined myself streamlined, all bone and severity, pure mind, free to contemplate the startling absence of any useful metaphysics, any final punishment or reward. Indulgences, no doubt. Romances I've allowed myself when nothing ached and the long diminishment seemed far off. Today, I want my body to keep making its sloppy requests. I'm out among the wayward dazzle of the countryside, which is its own afterlife, wild, repeatable. There's no lesson in it for me. I just like its ignorant thrust, its sure way back after months without desire. Are wild flowers holy? Are weeds? There's infinite hope if both are, but perhaps not for us. To skirt the woods, to walk deeply like this into the high grass, is to invoke the phantasms of sense and importance. I think I'm smelling the rain we can smell before it rains. It's the odor of another world. I'm convinced. Thank you, Stephen Dunn.
Thank you, Laura McCullough. Our next reader is Benjamin Paloff. He received the PhD in Slavic languages and literatures from Harvard University in 2007 and has been teaching at the University of Michigan since then. He's the author of two poetry collections and entitled And His Orchestra and The Politics, both from Carnegie Mellon University Press. Ben Paloff.
Thank you, BJ, and thank you, Peter, for organizing this. Stephen was one of the most important people in some sense in my life, insofar as he's one of the handful of people, most of whom were teachers, who gave me the life that I have. I don't lose track of that on any day. In fact, Stephen saved me in ways that he maybe didn't even know. Insofar as I started reading him when I was 15, and I had a string of really awful jobs. One of my crappy jobs was filing abuse reports for the Division of Youth and Family Services in Atlantic City. And Stephen's poems, when I was 15, were what I was reading in the break room. They rescued me from what was really an unpleasant time. I was drawn especially to his ability to say things in poems that were statements of the everyday announced as revelation, and then just as often statements of revelation that were announced as everyday. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and give an example of what I mean, a very short poem called The Liar. It's one of his earliest poems, 8 lines. Facts are what I love, their insignificance, the clay I make of them. All that's important is how I feel about you at any moment. And the truth is, I'm feeling rather indifferent, as if 1,000 Samoans were running their fingers through my hair in unison. You know what I mean. I often found when I was reading Stephen's poems that I knew exactly what he meant, but also found enough mystery in what he was saying or the way he was saying it, that it opened my eyes to that thing, to that meaning in a new way. Stephen took me in my senior year of high school in Atlantic City High School, let me into his writing workshop. This was a life-making experience for me, as was just coincidentally Stephen becoming a visiting professor at the University of Michigan when I was in the MFA program, and he then co-advised my MFA thesis. Since his death, I've been thinking a lot about acceptance. So I'm going to finish by reading his poem, a prose poem, Acceptance, from the book Riffs and Reciprocities. Certainly not of things as they are. Certainly not of a cosmology that posits we're insignificant, though of course we are. And aren't some of us less insignificant than others? The personal is what matters. This defeat, those mundanities, a few triumphs. And then the expansion of what personal means, another person's tragedy, a country's collapse. The larger the personal becomes, the greater our helplessness. Better to be furious at one thing, become radiant with purpose. Better to love links and rhythms than all-embracing answers. I accept the croissants at breakfast and the side dish of plums. I accept that we are designed to die and that hell is a more persuasive afterlife than heaven, though I accept neither. My friends flirt with the spiritual seductions of the East, but why would someone want to get in harmony with this universe? So much bad company. There are no escapes. Fall down 7 times, stand up 8. And as I've been wondering what it would mean after one passes to stand up the 8th time having fallen down 7, I think I'm looking at it in this gathering. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. Our next reader is Kimberly Gray. Her most recent book is Systems for the Future of Feelings. Her first book, The Opposite of Light, was awarded the 2015 Lexi Rudnitsky First Book Prize. She has served as a Wallace Stegner Fellow in Poetry at Stanford University. She's joining us with audio today, and I appreciate her being able to read the poem through the mic, even if we don't have a video feed for her. Kim, are you there?
Yes, thank you so much, BJ. And I'm so sorry I cannot get my video to work, and I don't know why.
These things happen, but you know what? It's the poem and the words you'll say that matters. So thank you.
And I have to say, it is very lovely to see everybody else's faces, even if you can't see mine. And just a very large thank you to Peter and BJ for putting this event together and including me. You are also 2 of my greatest teachers, along with Stephen, so I'm very grateful. A lot of people don't know this about me, but I grew up in a very large, very dysfunctional family that was also anti-intellectual. and education and creativity were not something that were ever fostered for me. So being a writer was not in the realm of possibility. It wasn't even something that I could imagine when I was younger. And I planned to study nursing and was actually, taking classes to fulfill a nursing degree when I signed up for Stephen's advanced poetry workshop as a freshman. And by the end of that semester, Stephen had told me, I think you should take yourself seriously as a writer. And nobody ever in my life had ever given me any kind of permission like that. And I think if he hadn't said that, and if he hadn't been the teacher that he was, the man that he was, and that his poems were as important to me as they were, that I wouldn't have the writing life that I have. So I'm very indebted to him and love him very much. I'm going to read his poem, Sadness, which is from one of my favorite books, Between Angels. Sadness. It was everywhere, in the streets and houses, on farms, and now in the air itself. It had come from history, and we were history, so it had come from us. I told my artist friends who courted it not to suffer on purpose, not to fall in love with sadness, because it would be naturally theirs without assistance. I had sad stories of my own, but they made me quiet the way my parents' failures once did. Nobody's business but our own. And besides, what was left to say these days when the unspeakable was out there being spoken, exhausting all sympathy? Yet feeling it, how difficult to keep the face's curtains closed. She left, he left, they died, the heart rising into the mouth and eyes. Everything so basic, so unhistorical at such times. And then, too, the woes of others would get in. But mostly I was inured and out to make a decent buck, or in pursuit of some slippery pleasure that was sadness disguised. I found it. It found me. Oh, my artist friends, give it up. Just mix your paints, stroke. The strokes unmistakably will be yours.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for that wonderful recitation. That was Kimberly Gray. Our next reader is Lawrence Raab. In 1999, Stephen Dunn and Lawrence Raab co-authored a chapbook of collaborative poems, Winter at the Caspian Sea. More than this, though, besides Stephen's wife, Barbara Hurd, Larry Raab was Stephen's main close reader of manuscripts, the person with whom Stephen would improve his poems through correspondence. In this way, in the last 30 years, Lawrence Raab's suggestions influenced Stephen's revisions, as Stephen's influence can be perceived in Larry's books. They each held the other to better lines. Lawrence Raab. So we're going to move on to the next reader and then perhaps come back to Larry if he joins us. Our next reader is Martin Farawell. Martin's first full-length collection of poetry, Odd Boy, was published in 2019. He currently directs the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation's poetry program and poetry festival. Martin Farawell.
Thank you. Thanks, BJ and Peter, for doing this. I only met Stephen on a few occasions, very briefly, so I know him almost entirely through the many stories from his friends and former students, and through the poems, which I've admired for decades. And This one has always struck me as particularly powerful and beautiful. It's the guardian angel. Afloat between lies and stale truths, he realizes he's never truly protected one soul. They all die anyway. And what good is solace? Solace is cheap. The signs are clear. The drooping wings, the shameless thinking about utility and self. It's time to stop. The guardian angel lives for a month with other angels, sings the angelic songs, is reminded that he doesn't have a human choice. The angel of love lies down with him, and loving restores to him his pure heart. Yet how hard it is to descend into sadness once more. When the poor are evicted, he stands between them and the bank. But the bank sees nothing in its way. When the meek are overpowered, he's there, the thin air through which they fall. Without effect, he keeps getting in the way of insults. He keeps wrapping his wings around those in the cold. Even his lamentations are unheard. Though now in for the long haul, trying to live beyond despair, he believes. He needs to believe everything he does takes root, hums beneath the surfaces of the world. Thanks, Stephen Dunn.
Thank you, Martin Farawell. Our next reader, if we can get him back, is Lawrence Raab. Larry? I can hear you. We can't see you yet, Larry.
Am I
There
now?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us, Larry.
Glad to be back. Thank you, BJ. Over the last few years, as Parkinson's wore Stephen down, I've thought of this moment when I'd be asked to speak. Two lines of poetry, neither mine nor his, kept returning to me as if they summed up what I wanted to say about Stephen. He was a man. Take him for all in all. I shall not look upon his like again. But I won't end there, having been invited to read a poem. And because loss has plenty of time to stab us in the heart, I have chosen what I think is Stephen's funniest poem, John and Mary. The day he wrote it, we were working together at Yaddo, which we did for decades. We'd write something new each morning, then talk about it at lunch, then we'd revise, then we'd play tennis. Stephen always won. That particular noon, after I read John and Mary, I said what we never said at those moments. This is terrific. Stephen was taken aback. He hadn't thought the poem amounted to much, that it was just a bit of fluff he'd put together because he needed to show me something. No, I said, it's terrific, really. After which, no doubt, I also said, but changed this word. John and Mary has an epigraph Stephen ascribes to a freshman's short story. There were pages of lines like this one floating around fractured English from student prose. All so funny they had to be true. Perhaps the night before, we'd given each other the assignment of using one to get a poem started. We did that sort of thing. John and Mary. John and Mary had never met. They were like two hummingbirds who also had never met. They were like gazelles who occupied different grassy plains, running in opposite directions from different lions. They were like postal clerks in different zip codes with different vacation time, their bosses adamant and clock driven. How could they get together? They were like two people who couldn't get together. John was a Sufi with a love of the dervish. Mary, of course, a Christian with a curfew. They were like two dolphins in the immensity of the Atlantic, one playful, the other stuck in a tuna net. Two absolutely different childhoods. There was simply no hope for them. They would never speak in person. When they ran across that windswept field toward each other, they were like two freight trains, one having left Seattle at 6:36 p.m. at an unknown speed, the other delayed in Topeka for repairs. The math indicated that they'd embrace in another world, if at all, like parallel lines, or merely appear kindred and close, like stars. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you. Our next reader is Gerry LaFemina. Gerry LaFemina is an associate professor of English at Frostburg State University and a poetry mentor in the Carl Low University Low Residency MFA program. His most recent book is Baby Steps in Doomsday Prepping. Gerry LaFemina.
I don't know if you heard that.
I'm sorry, Gerry.
I said thank you to Peter and BJ.
Oh, okay, good. Sorry, you were muted for some reason. Thanks.
And thanks to everybody who's read so far and who's going to read. This is a lovely way to celebrate Stephen. For the last 17 years, I've had the good fortune of living in the same town as Stephen. And I will say, after 15 months of COVID, I had the good fortune to go out to dinner with him, just the two of us, one last time. That hour and a half, I think, will stay with me forever. We had these dinners in which we talked about poetry and sports and teaching and other forms of nonsense. And then he would ask if I would take him to the casino, where we would inevitably lose a lot of money. This is his poem, The Insistence of Beauty. The day before those silver planes came out of the perfect blue, I was struck by the beauty of pollution rising from smokestacks near Newark, gray and white ribbons of it on their way to evanescence. And at impact, no doubt, certain beholders and believers from another part of the world must have seen what appeared gorgeous, the flames of something theirs being born. I watched for hours, mesmerized, that willful collision replayed, the better man in me not yielding, then yielding to revenge's sweet surge. The next day there was a photograph of dust and smoke ghosting a street, and another of a man you couldn't be sure was fear frozen or dead or made of stone. And for a while I was pleased to admire the intensity, or was it the coldness, of each photographer's good eye. For years I'd taken pride in resisting the obvious: sunsets, snowy peaks, a starlet's face, yet had come to realize even those, seen just right, can have their edgy place. And the sentimental, beauty's sloppy cousin, that enemy, can't it have a place too? Doesn't a tear deserve a close-up? When word came of a fireman who hid in the rubble so his dispirited search dog could have someone to find, I repeated it to everyone I knew. I did this for myself, not for community or beauty's sake, yet soon it had a rhythm and a frame.
Thank you, Gerry. Gorgeous recitation. Our next reader is Charles Rafferty. He's the author of 9 full-length collections of poetry and short stories. He's the co-director of the MFA in Creative Writing program at Albertus Magnus College in New Haven, Connecticut. Charles Rafferty.
Thank you so much, BJ and Peter, for putting this together. I knew Stephen, just briefly, I knew Stephen in 1986 when I was a junior in his class, and Local Time came out, which is the book of his that just blew me away. I had always liked Stephen's poetry, but I felt like he had become great when this book came out. So it was hugely influential. And I remember liking this poem in particular. I'm going to read Two Women, which is not a poem that he took for his selected poems. And I was always kind of disappointed about that. And I guess I've just always liked this poem because it's got one of those speakers who tells on himself, which I've always loved about Stephen's poetry. So this is called Two Women. This time I wasn't looking to look. I was waiting for a friend, and for all I chose to see, the park could have been an immense desolate beach. A wedding party was taking place near the fountain. I noticed it at first, heard it, but I was tired of celebrations not mine. I had turned away. Blue sky, the disciplined world of light. To my left was a small building, a powerhouse, and 2 young women from the wedding party had come to pee behind it. They didn't see me. It was the redness of their dresses that caught my eye. They pulled down their pantyhose, squatted in unison, all the while talking. It was like watching Degas ballerinas resting languidly at a rehearsal. I was careful not to move, careful to keep the scene as I wished to remember it, because by now it had become mine, and I saw their wrist corsages, and that one's dress was ruffled where the other's was plain. 15 seconds, 16, they must have drunk the same amount of champagne, raised the glasses to their lips at exactly the same time. I think it was Apollinaire who said, it's necessary to see, to drink, to piss as well as crickets in order to sing like them. 2 women practicing to be crickets. I was sorry to see it all end, the hitching up of the pantyhose, then each of them touching their hair out of habit as if the air were a mirror, and beauty something conscious again. They returned to the party. My friend arrived. The rest of the day was bright yellows, greens, every little thing coming out of its hiding place to be seen. That's Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you. To introduce Gregory Chernikian. For many years, Gregory Chernikian directed the creative writing program at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of 7 collections of poetry, most recently, Sojourners of the In-Between. Greg?
Thank you. I hope you all can see and hear me. Thank you, BJ, and thank you, Peter. I will miss Stephen very much. One of the things I will miss is the good talks that we had, the conversations. It's hard to find people who can talk as well as he did. Even in our casual discussions, it was as if he was almost writing or trying to write a poem, trying to get to the core of things, looking at things in different perspectives. He talked lovingly about his great sports love, basketball. And when he was doing it, describing, say, the precision of Steph Curry or the pirouetting ability of Michael Jordan, he wasn't only talking about athletics, his great love, of course, but he was also talking about grace and beauty and balance and how such gestures might make us dream of being better than we sometimes are. I loved playing ping pong with him. He used to come over to my house when he visited. I had a ping pong table in my basement. And I used to slam and grunt and hit as hard as I could. And there was Stephen at the other end smiling and with aplomb, returning all the shots back to me. And I tried to equalize our talents by giving him lots of brandy, one shot after another and another. And my strategy failed because he just became better and annihilated me. And I will look longingly at those annihilations. One last thing about competition. Stephen was a ferocious competitor and he loved winning. But when he lost, he was a gentleman at the ping pong table and on the court. He never made excuses for losing. He never gave any hard luck stories. He never complained. And I think that was how he was in life as well. He even said once that he felt very lucky that he had come as far as he did and as long as he had. He had a passion for life, I think. And I loved his fortitude and his exuberance and grit, and I will miss those very much. I'm going to read poem Different Hours from his collection Different Hours. Excuse me. As a small plane descended through the "It's all over now" Strom und Drang, I closed my eyes and saw myself in waves of lucidity, a vanisher in a long process of vanishing, of solitary character, truant heart. When we landed, I flicked down my daily mask, resumed my normal dreamy life of uncommitted crimes. I held nothing against me anymore, and now, next day, I wake before the sound of traffic, amazed that the paper has been delivered, that the world is up and working. A dazed rabbit sits in the dewy grass. The clematis has no aspirations as it climbs its trestle. I pour myself orange juice, home style. I say the hell with low-fat cream cheese and slather the good stuff on my bagel. The newspaper seems to be thinking my thoughts. No hope for lost men. Link between laughter and health. It says scientists know now the neutrino has mass, the most ghostly particle in the universe, one of them called it. No doubt other scientists are jealous who ask the right questions too late, some small failure of intuition leading them astray. No doubt too, at this very moment, a snake is sunning itself in Calcutta. And somewhere, a philosopher is erasing time's empty passing because he's seen a woman in a ravishing dress. In a different hour, he'll put it back.
Thank you very much, Gregg. That lovely reading of the title poem of Stephen's Pulitzer Prize winning book, Different Hours. Our next reader is Penny Dugan. Penny, are you here?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes.
Great. I'm on the shore of Lake Champlain where the miracle of broadband has not yet arrived. So I'm on a little bitty cell phone, doing my best.
Okay. Thank you for being here. Penny is Professor Emerita of Writing at Stockton University, and she was a cherished colleague of Stephen's for decades.
Gregg, I agree with you that Stephen was an incredible competitor. In Scrabble, he was not so gracious. He accused me of making up words. Anyway, Stephen had a gift for friendship, and like his other gifts, he worked hard at it and practiced until the grace of friendship was part of who he was. The occasional poems he wrote in his role as the Stockton Faculty Poet Laureate are gifts of friendship. Stephen gave me the Dugan Poem in April 1989. I'd been fired by Stockton after 13 years, and the faculty gave me a farewell, see you later party. Stephen's poem was a source for cheer during the years of exile. The Dugan Poem. One can imagine Penny early on, the Jesuit saying X, and something unconscious in her saying Y, until the Y's turned truly interrogative, and the forbidden started to call her from its moist places, and soon she was going her contrary way, which led her here, to us, where she continued to be contrary and lovable, the Irish in her pumping charm into even the most dutiful day. Argument and persuasion, it must have been she who named the course naturally, as if she were coining her own nickname. Surely no one else has twisted my arm and made it feel like a caress. Surely no one else has elicited so many yeses from so many of the unwilling. Those impervious to Penny's talent and charm, those Veras and Chucks, let us feel sorry for their sorry stone hearts. They will be singing their insincere songs while Penny is somewhere changing some nipper's life, drumming home the difficult news from books, warming it, letting it pass through her. No defeat, William Carlos Williams said, is made up entirely of defeat, since the world it opens is always a place formerly unsuspected. May the world now open up to her anew. May there be huzzas and hurdles and wild surprises. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Penny. Penny, I believe you're sharing your screen, so if you could share that, that would be great. Thank you. Great, thank you. And our next reader, hello, Rob, it's good to see you. You're actually 2 readers from now, so I'm just going to take your camera off for a moment. Our next reader is Jim Hollis. Jim Hollis is a Washington, D.C. based Jungian psychoanalyst and the author of 17 books. He served as executive director of the Jung Educational Center in Houston, Texas for many years. He taught with Stephen for years in Stockton's literature program. Jim, right now you are muted, so if you could unmute yourself.
All right, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you, but we can hear you loud and clear, Jim.
I don't know what happened to the picture. I was on a while ago and I can see you clearly, but as long as you can hear me, that's all that matters. Actually, here, 1 second, there's another pop-up on my screen. So share the webcam. Well, I don't think it's working, so it doesn't matter. Actually, Penny and I were deputized by Stockton to say to you 2 fellows who used to be in our classes that we've been looking at your transcripts and we found that you're actually a couple of credits short. So we're going to have to be asking you to come back in the fall, I'm afraid. So
I will do that with pleasure. I wish I'd appreciated being a student as much as I would do so now, right? Thank you. As long as you're teaching, I'll be in the room.
Well, it's a privilege. Some of you know, Stephen and I have been in a conversation now for nearing half a century. And it's a conversation that occurs. I've found since his passing that I think of him every day. And I also talk to him every day. And that's an informing experience because as we know, death does not end relationships that matter to us. And underneath all of this is the grief we have for a loss. And at the same time, it's in direct proportion to the gift that we received in the first place. So where there's a gift, there is also great loss. I was always reminded of the universality of this experience by the poem written by Callimachus, the Greek poet from over 23 centuries ago, who wrote about the death of his friend. Let me share that with you briefly. They told me, Heraclitus, they told me you were dead. They brought me bitter news to hear and bitter tears to shed. I wept as I remembered how often you and I had tired the sun with talking and sent him down the sky. And now that thou art lying, my dear old carrion guest, a handful of gray ashes, long, long ago at rest, still are there thy pleasant voices, thy nightingales awake. For death he taketh all away, but them he cannot take. So tonight we are enjoying the continuing voice of Stephen that you've all celebrated so well. The poem I'm going to read is called Ambush at 5 o'clock. It appeared in the New Yorker in 2014. It was one of 19 poems that appeared in New Yorker. So Ambush at 5 o'clock. We were by the hedge that separates our properties when I asked our neighbors about their souls. I said it with a smile, the way one asks such a thing. They were somewhat like us, I thought, more than middle-aged, less dull than most, yet they seemed to have no interest in disputation, our favorite game, or in any of the great national pastimes like gossip and stories of misfortunes about people they disliked. In spite of these differences, kindred was a word we often felt and used. The man was shy, though came to life when he spotted an uncommon bird, and the woman lively, sometimes even funny, about barometer readings and sudden dips in pressure, the general state of things. We liked their affection for each other and for dogs. We went to their house, they came to ours. After I asked about their souls, they laughed and stumbled toward an answer, then gave up, turned the question back on me. And because I felt mine was always in jeopardy, I said it went to the movies and hasn't been seen since. I said gobbledy and I said gook. I found myself needing to fool around, avoid, stay away from myself. But my wife said her soul suffered from neglect, that she herself was often neglectful of important things, but so was I. Then she started to cry. What's the matter? I asked. What brought this on? She didn't answer. I felt ambushed, publicly insensitive about something, whatever it was. It was a dusky 5 o'clock, that time in between one thing and another. Our neighbors retreated to their home, but the woman returned. Without a word, put her arms around my wife, as if a woman weeping indicated something already understood among women that needn't be voiced. They held each other, rocked back and forth, and I thought, Jesus Christ, am I guilty again of one of those small errors I've repeated until it became large? What about me, I thought? What about the sadness of being stupid? Why doesn't her husband return and with maybe a beer and a knowing nod? Well, I did something that you're never supposed to do with artists. I said, now, Stephen, did that really happen? And he said, no, I made it all up. And that's what Stephen did, and that's what poets do. They make things up, and they illumine our lives with what they've made up. So I thank you for bringing about this evening, and I thank my dear brother, Stephen.
Jim Hollis, thank you. Thank you for everything you just said. Our final reader of the first half of this evening, and we'll just take a 5-minute break and continue with Peter Murphy as your MC. I just want to ask Wanda Praisner, check your email, please. Our final reader is Robert Gregg. Rob is the Dean of the School of General Studies at Stockton University. He's also a professor of history. Rob Gregg.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Terrific. I'm equally nervous about my imposter syndrome and my sense that my audio, my camera might not work. So imposter being the fact that I'm a historian and not a poet like the rest of you fellows and contributors. So, but the reason I'm here probably is that I was Stephen's dean back in 2005 as the Dean of Arts and Humanities. And we've heard a lot about his competitiveness, and I witnessed that having blood drawn on at the ping pong table and on the tennis court myself. But he was also a very supportive person, and when I started as the dean, I began by sending out updates on what other people were doing in the school. And Stephen jumped on this and said, you know, you should do more of this because it will stimulate productivity and creativity. And just as a way of demonstrating this, I mean, not necessarily demonstrating this, but just as a byproduct of one of these things, I did an update on Bill Lubinow, and he was working on some obscure conservative politician in 19th century Britain. And 2 or 3 days later, I received a poem from Stephen that was called Conservative, and it had an epigraph from this conservative named Cornford. And the epigraph was, every public action which is not customary either is wrong, or if it is right, is a dangerous precedent. It follows that nothing should ever be done for the first time. And this had obviously struck a chord with Stephen because he found it as, you know, that he had to kind of challenge this head on. And he, you know, I responded to it, and it was, you know, very, tried to be.
I have both right now.
I tried to be as thoughtful as I could. But the poem kept on changing, and in its second rendering, called Absolutely, he sounded almost like a Molly Maguire or a punk rocker trying to destabilize everything and get rid of everything, which seemed very uncharacteristic of what I knew about Stephen. So, which was
the audio is clicked on.
which was fun to read.
Mm.
Anyway, and over the next 4 or 5 months, it obviously changed, because by September he came to do a reading at Stockton, and the poem had been transformed utterly again, and it was now called The Soul's Agents. And I think I asked him later. I visited him in Frostburg, and I thought, oh, maybe I had some influence. He said, oh, no. Larry is the person I turned to, so putting that notion to rest very quickly. But what had seemed to be a poem chastising a conservative initially, and which had taken on an almost the tone of a Molly Maguire in the second rendering, had now become more muted. Instead of the revolutionary let's destabilize everything, the narrator had now taken on a more ironic or sardonic air as an advisor to us, tempting us to transgress. What Stephen had now created was a 21st century stand-in for Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, or at least that was my rendering of it, my feeling about it. So here's the poem, The Soul's Agents. Every night before bed, say for a week, we recommend admitting a lie or a deception sotto voce, a rogue's prayer to the soul you know you have, no matter how tattered or dormant. Trust us, your secrets differentiate you from no one, but the soul awakens a little when it hears them. We have its interests at heart, which means your interests as well. Try to practice unsettling what remains settled in you, those ideas, for example, inherited, still untested. And if only you could raise your hypocrisy to the level of art, like forgery, there might be real hope for you. Some people, of course, expect to be rewarded for stumbling and rising from the floor and stumbling again, but we give no credit for living. We favor vitality over goodness, even over effort. We love a great belly laugh more than anything. In your case, we do worry. There may not be enough quarrel in you or enough courage to acknowledge your worst inclinations. Know that the soul converts them into tenderness. Nothing pleases it more. So next week, why not admit that what Raskolnikov did has always made you dream? The more you expose yourself, the more you become unrecognizable. Remember, we are here to help. What you decide to keep from the world, tell us. We understand everything. We pass it on. So thank you, Stephen, for your great poem.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Stephen Dunn, a tribute reading. Wanda, it's so good to have you. Sorry for the trouble you had getting in.
Oh my.
Let me introduce you. You'll be the first reader of the second half, and you'll be followed by Christine Salvatore. Wanda S. Praisner has received the Egan Award, Kudzu Prize, and the 2017 New Jersey Poets Prize. Her sixth book is To Illuminate the Way. Wanda Praisner.
Thank you, BJ. Hello, everyone. Well, what to say except we've all been diminished by Stephen's passing. Our dear friend, his extraordinary poetry, best poet, best teacher. He enriched our lives, guided us to become more than we were. After hearing him read at the first Arts Festival in '86, I enrolled into his summer Stockton Artist Teacher Institute. He called me a rookie. Well, it wasn't easy. He demanded our best, but he was helpful. He was generous. It's where I wrote my first poem. Nightmare still of running back from the dorm past Fred Lake, in hand a poem I'd written from the morning prompt. Trust me, he told us, something will happen. He also said you wouldn't catch me doing that. Summer after summer, I returned. Everything I learned from him found its way to my students, and I wrote. It said, the loved ones we mourn, no longer with us, are now always, forever, where we are. Thank you, Stephen, for your presence in our lives, for sharing your great gifts. Bon voyage, love, and God bless. I'd like to read a poem from his 1976 book, Full of Lust and Good Usage. The Carpenter's Song, for Ted Porter. When I am no longer young, let me be able to make wine from chokeberries and care enough to let it age. And when friends come, let them sip it on a torn out car seat under a tree. And let my house smell of books and pipe smoke, and let its disarray be the luxury of a man who makes cabinets. And after it gets dark, let's move to the room where the squeeze box is, sing songs, and talk of Iceland by freighter, Newfoundland on a whim, all the arrivals one doesn't plan. And let the evidence be deep in my voice, the lines of my face. And let me call this style. Let me rebuild then the lighthouse my father rebuilt years ago. And let me know the history of old houses haunted by ruts and shadows. And when asked, let me sense what can be redeemed and what can't. And yes, let me be able to say I'm a builder of houses, a man who works slow and knows how hard it is to get the inside just right. And let my metaphors grow from that. Something lived, stretching out, trying to make contact with something else. And let me call this my work. And when I'm no longer young, let there be poets in my life, their words aftertastes on the tongue. And let me speak those words like a man who has heard a spar snap on a ship, who has been lost once or twice and come back. And let me declare I've been a lover of women without declaring it, and feel I've treated them better than wood, knowing I've been a husband of wood, have cared for it with my own hands. And let my hands be thick badges of power, really used. My first, my fist, an inner fist the size of a heart. And let this be visible to men. And let the old deaf dog sense me coming a long way off, ready to forgive anything I've done. And let me call all this some goddamn luck.
Thank you, Wanda. Thank you for your patience in doing this and for arriving and delivering that beautiful poem.
I had my son and daughter helping me, 2 PhDs in Connecticut.
From his early book, Full of Lust and Good Usage. So at this point, I turn over the MC duties to my co-host, Peter E. Murphy. Peter, it's all yours.
Thank you, BJ. I'm not sure I can do this. How do you spell MC? I'm getting confused here. Anyway, I hope that I can follow you with as much verve as you have done. Our first reader in, well, our second reader now in part 2 is Christine Salvatore. Christine was a student of Stephen's, and she continues, somehow manages, I don't know how she does it, to write while teaching at a high school in South Jersey, as well as in the MFA program at Rosemont College, and also as an adjunct at Stockton. So I don't know if she sleeps or not, but she's going to read a poem to us. So please welcome Christine Salvatore.
Thank you, Peter. A few years ago, I had the honor of teaching or co-teaching a workshop with Stephen Dunn. But thanks to Peter Murphy, I first took that same workshop with Stephen when I was a high school student of 17 years old. I stayed for 5 years at Stockton to work with Stephen. Since then, he has been a presence in my life as the man who taught me to avoid absolutes, earn my endings, teach a rigorous and useful workshop, and so much more. This is his poem, Propositions. Anyone who begins a sentence with, "in all honesty," is about to tell a lie. Anyone who says, "this is how I feel," had better love form more than disclosure. Same for anyone who thinks he thinks well because he had a thought. If you say "you're ugly" to an ugly person, no credit for honesty, which must always be a discovery, an act that qualifies as an achievement. If you persist, you're just a cruel bastard, a pig without a mirror, somebody who hasn't examined himself enough. A hesitation hints at an attempt to be honest, suggests a difficulty is present. A good sentence needs a clause or two, interruptions set off by commas, evidence of a slowing down, of rethinking. Before I asked my wife to marry me, I told her I'd never be fully honest. No one, she said, had ever said that to her. I was trying to be radically honest, I said, but in fact had another motive. A claim without a "but" in it is at best only half true. In all honesty, I was asking in advance to be forgiven. Thank you, Stephen.
And thank you, Christine. That was lovely. Our next reader is Mimi Schwartz, who has the honor of having been a classmate of Stephen's at Forest Hills High School in Queens, New York, as well as being a colleague at Stockton University. Her latest book is Good Neighbors, Bad Times, Revisited. Please welcome Mimi Schwartz.
So yes, I knew Stephen in high school when he was not yet a poet. He was a basketball player, and with no outward signs of the poet. So he was a jock, and a freckled face, with a will to win, but also that disarming smile that I met again 25 years later at a reunion when I was about to teach at Stockton. And someone said, "Oh, you should meet Stephen Dunn. He's teaching there too." And I turn around and there he is, Stephen Dunn, but hard to recognize because he still had that same disarming smile, but a very bushy beard and a beret. But he was still the same generous guy who made you feel that he was really listening to you. And I was very lucky from then on to feel again Stephen's friendship for the next 25 years at Stockton as an inspiration and as a tennis player and as a very savvy reader of my writing. And I'd like to read If a Clown, and I think because it combines the whimsy and the wisdom that was so much a part of the man and the poet I knew. So it was first, I think, appeared in the New Yorker. And one piece of background information on it is that Stephen said it began with a local radio announcer saying that a clown came out, was trying to hitchhike. And like the clown in the poem, Stephen could take a small detail and turn it into art. So it's called If a Clown. If a clown came out of the woods, a standard-looking clown with oversized polka dot clothes, floppy shoes, a red bulbous nose, and you saw him on the edge of your property, there'd be nothing funny about that, would there? A bear might be preferable, especially if black and berry-driven. And if this clown began waving his hands with those big white gloves that clowns wear, and you realized he wanted your attention, had something apparently urgent to tell you, would you pivot and run from him or stay put, as my friend did, who seemed to understand that here was a clown who didn't know where he was, a clown without a context. What could be sadder, my friend thought, than a clown in need of a context? If then the clown said to you that he was on his way to a kid's birthday party, his car had broken down and he needed a ride, would you give it to him? Or would the connection between the comic and the appalling as it pertained to clowns be suddenly so clear that you'd be paralyzed by it? And if you were the clown and my friend hesitated as he did, would you make a sad face and with an enormous finger wipe away an imaginary tear? How far would you trust your art? I can tell you it worked. Most of the guests had gone when my friend and the clown drove up and the family was angry. But the clown twisted a balloon into the shape of a bird and gave it to the kid, who smiled, let it rise to the ceiling. If you were the kid, the birthday boy, from then on, what would be your relationship with disappointment, with joy? Whom would you blame or extol? Thank you, Stephen. And thank you all for your wonderful poems and your stories about him tonight. It's special.
And thank you, Mimi. Our next reader is Kathleen Graber. And Kathy was teaching middle school English in Wildwood, New Jersey when she started studying with Stephen in the mid-90s. She is now a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University in the MFA program. Her latest book is The River Twice. So Kathy, are you there?
You hear me, see me? There we go. Can you hear me?
Just like Tommy, hear me, see me. Yep.
Yes, good. Okay. That is true. I was a middle school teacher, and I'm grateful to Stephen for letting me sit in on his class. I didn't know anything about contemporary American poetry. And Stephen was incredibly tough on me, terrifically tough on me. So there was a part of me that was thinking, who is this Stephen Dunn who was so kind to all these undergraduates? But I think he was wise enough to be the teacher that we each needed him to be. I remember him saying that the apprenticeship of a poet is 30 years, and I was almost 40 when he told me that. And I said, oh, no problem. You know, Stanley Kunitz is 95. So I'm going to read Mary Shelley in Brigantine. I'm sorry that my crazy dog is barking in the background. Perhaps he'll stop. Stephen, you know, sort of, I think he told me that you can never risk underestimating your reader. And so this poem actually expects a lot of the reader. To know about Mary Shelley's life, to know about the town of Brigantine. And so just if you haven't read Frankenstein lately, that's Mary Shelley. Frankenstein is the doctor, not the monster. Mary Shelley started a very public affair with Percy while he was still married. For that, they were ostracized. During that time, she became pregnant, delivered a premature child, and the child died. Her mother, in fact, 3 of her 4 children died in infancy. Her mother was a very famous, the very famous early feminist, Mary Wollstonecraft. And Brigantine is a little town that is northeast of Atlantic City, and it used to have a gigantic amusement called Brigantine Castle, which was like a haunted house kind of thing. And at one time in the 70s, it attracted 1 million visitors a year, if you can imagine that. But it was damaged in a storm and then caught fire and was finally torn down. And Brigantine's also the home of the nonprofit, if you're looking to make a donation, Marine Mammal Stranding Center. So I love this poem. This is Mary Shelley in Brigantine. Because the ostracized experience the world in ways particular to themselves, often seeing it clearly, yet with such anger and longing that they sometimes enlarge what they see. She first saw Brigantine as a paradise for gulls. She must be a sea creature washed ashore. How startling, though, no one knew about her past, the scandal with Percy, the tragic early deaths. Yet sad that her Frankenstein had become just a name, like Dracula or Satan, something that stood for a kind of scariness, good for a laugh. She found herself welcome everywhere. People would tell her about Brigantine Castle, turned house of horror. They thought she'd be pleased that her monster roamed its dark corridors, making children scream. They lamented the day it was raised. Thus, Mary Shelley found herself accepted by those who had no monster in them, the most frightening people alive, she thought. Didn't they know Frankenstein had abandoned his creation, set him loose without guidance or a name? Didn't they know what it feels like to be lost, freaky, forever seeking who you are? She was amazed now that people believed you could shop for everything you might need. She loved that in the dunes you could almost hide. At the computer store, she asked an expert, is there such a thing as too much knowledge or going too far? He directed her to a website where he thought the answers were. Yet Mary Shelley realized that the pain she felt all her life was gone. Could her children, dead so young, be alive somewhere too? She couldn't know that only her famous mother had such a chance. She was almost ready to praise this awful world. Thank you, Stephen. I miss you so much.
Thank you, Kathy. And I think in the spirit of Mary Shelley, he misses us too. Our next reader is Brian McWilliams. Brian has been a friend and helper for Stephen since he returned from Moscow, where he was headquartered for 15 years as a freelance reporter. His first book is a memoir about those 15 years he spent there called The Light's Team, and more recently, a Holocaust book for young adults called The Girl in the Haystack. Brian McWilliams.
Hi. So as Stephen was dying, I didn't go out to see him or to visit him, which was the right decision. It ultimately felt right. It just not at first. And while I was sort of feeling around, trying to know what to do or what not to do, I just found myself, picking up his work, and not just to be with his work, I think, but probably, it was a way to sort of be with him. And at first I was reading, most days, I just read silently, like I normally do to myself. And some days, God, there's so much good work. I just read it out loud. And on some days, at around 5 o'clock, as Stephen was wont to do, I'd pour myself a scotch and read some work as well. Sometimes 2 scotches. Depends. Anyway, some of you know how that works. So anyway, I discovered this poem, and I probably should say rediscovered, because I read the poem before. Obvious. I just didn't remember. I just don't remember reading it for the first time. It's part of his selected poems from the early 1990s. It just felt like a discovery because it was so surprising, and there's so much heat in it. And, it uses language Stephen doesn't normally use in ways he doesn't normally use it. And it spoke so much to our times and to all time, and some of the other things I was feeling other than despair and sadness. Anyway, I'm going to read it. It's titled Having Lost All Capacity, and it begins, it carries the epigraph from Terence. I am a man and count nothing human alien to me. Having lost all capacity. Today I read how Japanese fishermen lured thousands of dolphins ashore, slaughtering them because they eat fish the fishermen want to catch and sell. And tomorrow it'll be people once again mutilating other people, and there'll come a time when I'll just sit there, turning the pages, having lost all capacity for horror. And so much that is human will be alien to me. I want to kill all the killers. I walk past my wife with a kitchen knife and out the door into streets where others like me will be slashing at wind and shadows until the first ripped neck. I hear everything gets calmer then. After the first time with a girl, I remember smelling my fingers and then tasting them. And that's what I hear the first righteous murder smells and tastes like, only better. And with the headlines from a week of tabloids in my mouth, I'll know what the end of the world tastes like. Irresistible. And that's all I can think about here in my room, the sons of bitches, the bastards. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Our next reader is Emery De Georgio. Emery is a former student of Stephen, like so many of us, and now she's a professor of writing at Stockton. Her two books of poetry are The Things a Body Might Become and Girl Torpedo. Please welcome Emery De Georgio.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you, BJ. Thank you, everyone who's sharing this celebration of Stephen. I feel incredibly grateful to be here with you. I'm going to read from sort of the tribute that I wrote, like Maxine, for Stephen's 82nd birthday. So I met Stephen Dunn on Stockton's second preceptorial advising day in the spring of the 2000 semester, and he was wearing one of his signature tapestry vests, and he read through this blue velvet journal I brought as my writing sample. I remember the silence of the room and the attention he gave my work. And I was terrified that he would tell me I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong, and I sat a long time in that silence. Instead, he noted which of the modern poets he could hear echoes of in my work, and then he listed a dozen contemporary poets I should read over the summer as he authorized the POI for advanced poetry. In retrospect, what I appreciate most about this first encounter was the dignity and kindness he showed a first-year college student. He didn't ridicule what I now know was light verse and teen angst. He didn't shame my lack of education or literary culture. And he gave me my first instruction for being a poet, to read. In the fall semester, he gave me my second, that talent will only take you so far. I mean, I think Kathy was onto something when she said how he knew how to be the right kind of teacher. So writing poetry has always been hard for me, the letting go, the act of discovery. And I envied my classmates who an hour before class could write a melodious poem with intricate metaphors. I labored, still do, over each line, and every draft felt incomplete. Stephen gave our poems equal attention and sparse praise. He was more interested in the quality of our thinking and our work ethic. As a first-generation student from Piney Hollow, New Jersey, who always felt out of my league, for once it didn't matter from where I came or how gifted I was. I could become the poet, the scholar, the person I wanted to be. None of it was preordained. Stephen made poetry mine. I'm going to read his poem, Sweetness. Just when it seemed I couldn't bear one more friend waking with a tumor, one more maniac with a perfect reason, often a sweetness has come and changed nothing in the world except the way I stumbled through it. For a while lost in the ignorance of loving someone or something, the world shrunk to mouth size, hand size, and never seeming small. I acknowledge There is no sweetness that doesn't leave a stain, no sweetness that's ever sufficiently sweet. Tonight, a friend called to say his lover was killed in a car he was driving. His voice was low and guttural. He repeated what he needed to repeat, and I repeated the one or two words we have for such grief until we were speaking only in tones. Often, a sweetness comes as if on loan, stays just long enough to make sense of what it means to be alive, then returns to its dark source. As for me, I don't care where it's been or what bitter road it's traveled to come so far, to taste so good. Thank you, Stephen.
And thank you, Emery. Our next reader is Madeline Dunninger. And like Emery, Madeline was a freshman, a 16-year-old freshman, when she nervously showed Stephen some of her poems. That was in the 70s. Since then, she's become a close friend of Barbara and Stephen's. They travel together, and she continues to write from Sonoma, California, and Margate, New Jersey. And Maddie also serves on the Board of Trustees of Stockton University. Thank you, Maddie, for being here.
Thank you for asking me, and thank you for organizing this. And I have to say, my heart is just going, it's flip-flopping all over the place, because I realize the love that we all have for Stephen. And yeah, it's been almost 45 years. It's so hard to believe that, since literally I came to his office and my hands were shaking as I handed him the poems to apply to get into the advanced poetry writing workshop. And that would have been in January of '77. So Stephen cracked the world of contemporary poetry open for me. And Emery, the way you describe it, that's exactly the way it was. His first book had only been out for a little while, Looking for Holes in the Ceiling. And I think he was the first poet that I'd heard in a poetry reading. And it was just a wonderful experience. And one of the things tonight, I remember how he looked, and he wore a dashiki. Some of you are probably chuckling at that. And I thought, I'm going to wear my dashiki while I read this poem, which comes from Looking for Holes in the Ceiling. It's called A Poem for Atheists. I drill a hole in my ceiling, hoping for the best. It is a hole in the floor when I go upstairs, and that alone is something, but not very much. Friends come over. They urge me to fix it, to make it appear as if nothing had happened, and that is very funny. So I draw eyelashes around it. Oh, it is a joke, people say, but they don't understand it is not a joke too. Upstairs, I get on my stomach, and downstairs, I stand on my own 2 feet, watching it and looking through it, hoping for the best. I give it a name to distinguish it from others. Roberta, I call it, but that is hardly the last word. There are names now for craters in the moon, for the gaps in my resume, for oblivion. So next to it, with great strokes, I design the hieroglyphic for prudes, to do what my face alone could never accomplish. Gradually, I forget about it. Only a spider now and then reminds me of what foresight I had, though there have been no messages, not even a pole, nor a fireman. Thank you so much. Miss you, Stephen.
Thank you, Maddie. Our next reader is Mary Lisa De Dominicus. After traveling from the wilds of Pennsylvania, she wound up in South Jersey and studied with Stephen as an adult student. And not too long after, her book of poems, Almost All Red, won the Still Waters Poetry Press Award. So Mary Lisa, you're here. Let's see if we can, where you are, and if you would. Okay, well, we can hear you. Why don't you read now? And So we can hear what you have.
Okay, it says my session is running already, so okay, I'll just read what I have. Although he wouldn't meet me until 11 years later, I met Stephen when I was 11. I say I met him because his writing invited me in. That's what his poetry does, I think, for everyone. As an 11-year-old metaphysical poet from Wilkes-Barre, a little coal mining town nestled in a valley near Scranton, PA, as Peter mentioned, I discovered the only one contemporary book, Looking for Holes in the Ceiling, 1974, tucked in between the overwhelming hedge of classics I'd already read and reread at my local library. In the next 2 years, they'd add 2 more contemporary books, Full of Less Than Good Usage, and a book by Nikki Giovanni, The Women and the Men. For this particular time period, both were considered progressive. Imagine my surprise 11 years later, when in May of 1987, my husband's job transferred him to South Jersey, where we moved with our 10-month-old son. I didn't know anyone and my family had disowned me. My husband realized how much I missed my secretarial position with the Wyoming Valley Poetry Society, and after noticing an ad in the local newspaper, the Atlantic City Press, he saw Stephen's name, knew he was my favorite poet, and signed me up to attend a week-long session with the New Jersey Artists and Teachers Institute at Stockton University, where I took poetry classes with Stephen and his associate, Peter Murphy, both of whom I've come to love dearly. Afterward, I took every class I could with Stephen and with Peter Murphy as well. Stephen was my first poetry teacher, but more than that, he was a friend. When he was told I had brain surgery in 1992, he was kind enough to send a letter to Wilkes-Barre, where I was healing. He once called me Mary Lisa of the melodic line. Who forgets that? When he acknowledged me for inspiring the title of his poem, Dancing with God, I was ecstatic. And when he nominated my chapbook, Almost All Read, for a pushcart prize, I felt I was finally a real writer. For if Stephen admires your work, who else matters? Here was a man who welcomed writers into his home with open arms and heart, after inviting famous poets to read for Stockton's Visiting Writers series. There we would gather and mingle with both famous and student poets, develop new friendships, and branch out. It was as if Stephen was the trunk, and the hundreds of poets I've met, and my very closest friends, are all a piece of him. A branch, a twig, a blossom, a flower, so many flowers and seeds. I can't imagine my life without him. A dedicated man who gave me, as well as his other students, constant encouragement, and who I hope knew how much he healed me, both emotionally and physically, following my brain surgery. I even sent my own son to Hofstra, and he, Austin Walker, credits his own public speaking abilities to attending Stephen's readings, as well as to the many other writers Stephen invited to read. Stephen was the closest poet I know who came to taming and teaching Keats' negative capability theory. That is, to hold 2 opposing opinions at the same time and to be at peace with that internal battle. Through his writing, he stood at the edge of the cliff in wonder, then returned always like a gift, bringing that wonder back to share with the world. Tonight I'm going to read the poem Dancing with God, from the book Between Angels, as I feel this poem represents my previous thoughts. I had some metaphors that I lost about my dad and the way they both navigated roads and how they were both lyrical and metaphysical. And, my dad was this concrete truck driver. So, but he was an artist at heart. Dancing with God. At first, the surprise of being singled out, the dance floor crowded, and me not looking my best, a too often worn dress, and the man with me, a budding casualty of some repetition too much. God just touched his shoulder and he left. Then the confirmation of an old guess. God was a wild God, into the most mindless rock, but graceful, looking. This excited me, like no one I could love. Cruel mouth, eyes evocative of promises unkempt. I never danced better, freer, as if dancing were my way of saying how easily I could be with him or apart. When the music turned slow, God held me, and I felt for a moment I'd mistaken him, that he was deaf, and that this, the famous embrace before the lights go out. But God kept holding me, and I him, until the band stopped, and I stood looking at a figure I wanted to slap or forgive for something I couldn't decide which. He left then, no thanks, no sign that he felt anything more than an earthly moment with someone who could have been anyone on earth. To this day, I don't know why I thought he was God, though it was clear there was no going back to the man who brought me, nice man, with whom I'd slept and grown tired, who danced wrong, who never again could do anything right. Thank you, and thank you everyone for giving me this great honor and putting this together for the people who all love and miss Stephen so dearly.
Thank you, Mary Lisa. Our next reader is Subaga Crystal Bacon, who lives, writes, and teaches in North Central Washington. She not only studied with Stephen when she lived in New Jersey, but also had the pleasure, who knows, of being Stephen's daughter Andrea Dunn's high school English teacher, and I believe her senior year. Subaga's latest book of poems is called Blue Hunger. Welcome, please.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you, BJ, both of you, for including me in this reading tonight. Yes, that's my little story about how I met Stephen. It was in the early 1980s. I was Andrea's English teacher and creative writing teacher, and also her hockey coach. And I met Stephen at a hockey parents dinner, which was a little gathering to bring the kids' parents together and have a chance to meet the coaches. And he and I had poems in the same a small New Jersey journal. I don't remember which one. So we knew each other by name. I hadn't really heard of him before that. And we had a conversation, and he invited me to join his workshop and said, you know, it's always nice to have adult students in the workshop. And I studied with him for a number of years until he finally kicked me out and told me that he had taught me everything he had to teach me and that I should get myself into an MFA program, which was easier said than done, but nevertheless accomplished. And I just loved him so very much. He was a marvelous friend and a wonderful teacher, and so many wonderful times at his home after readings, sharing drinks and food and conversation. And I met some really dear friends there, including BJ. I'm going to read the title poem from his beautiful book, Between Angels, so you can see how careworn this book cover is. Stephen was a master of really memorable lines, and this poem has a couple of my favorite of those really memorable lines. Between Angels. Between angels, on this earth absurdly between angels, I try to navigate in the bluesy middle ground of desire and withdrawal, in the industrial air, among the bittersweet efforts of people to connect, make sense, endure. The angels out there, what are they? Old helpers, half believed, or dazzling better selves imagined, that I turn away from, as if I preferred all the ordinary, dispiriting tasks at hand. I shop in the cold neon aisles, thinking of pleasure. I kiss my paycheck, a mournful kiss goodbye, thinking of pleasure in the evening, replenish my drink, make a choice to read or love or watch, and increasingly I watch. I do not mind living like this. I cannot bear living like this. Oh, everything's true at different times in the capacious day, just as I don't forget and always forget. Half the people in the world are dispossessed. Here, chestnut oaks and tenements make their unequal claims. Someone thinks of betrayal. A child spills her milk. I'm on my knees, cleaning it up. Sponge, squeeze. I change nothing, just move it around. The inconsequential floor is beginning to shine. Thank you, Stephen. Love you always and miss you.
Thank you, Sabaga. Our next reader is Lisa Hanukkah, currently the Dean of Arts and Humanities at Stockton University and a professor of British literature who also loves a lot of British mysteries. And Lisa was a friend and colleague of Stephen's for many years. Lisa, I know you're out there. There you are. We don't quite hear you yet, so you want to turn on your unmute yourself there.
Okay, can you hear me?
And now, yep.
Got me. Okay, good. I'm here not as a poet, but as a colleague. I met Stephen for the first time in the copy room at the School of Arts and Humanities. And he asked me, we ended up talking about a student. You know, he asked me if I knew this particular student, and I responded, that student is smarter than I am. And he said, he's smarter than all of us. And that, I think, kind of set the tone for our collegial relationship that followed. I saw him teach once. I know all of you have much experience with his teaching. I did not have as much, though I saw him read many times. But I was amazed when I saw him in a senior seminar situation, having taught that class myself so many times, and hearing him zero in one or two brief sentences on exactly what a student needed to do with the final paper they were writing. And I was with a friend from the literature program at the time, and we both were just amazed and so happy for our students that they got to experience this and learn from this. And the number of poets here just suggest how very successful he was as a teacher. And even though I am not, again, not a poet, I am a teacher, and I certainly do a lot of interrogation of poetry. And working on the exhibit, I worked on an exhibit of Stephen's revision process, an opportunity that fell in my lap and was an enormous amount of fun. But it showed me a lot about point of view, a lot about Stephen's point of view in particular. And I decided that that would be the theme of my reading tonight, was point of view. That's my preferred route to understanding people and books. And I wanted to choose something as a result from local visitations. And so I chose Poe in Margate. Hold on. To come back and learn his alcoholism was an illness. Poe had to laugh at that. He knew the vanity of excuses better than anyone, and how good self-destruction feels when one is in the act of it. Still, he thought, you must be sober to write your autobiography, set things straight. He'd give up all notions of a kingdom by the sea, try to see things as they were and are. But soon came the old constant rebellion of the senses and mind. Soon he remembered that truth was an enormous house shrouded in mist with many secret vaults, and that perfect sobriety is the state in which you make the version of yourself you like best, just another way to lie. He'd have just one drink before dinner to ease in the night, and from his window watch monstrous Lucy the elephant closing up, tourists no longer walking in her body and looking out of her eyes. The world was stranger than he had imagined it, certainly no less strange. The newspaper that arrived daily at his doorstep was storied with men who murdered because voices told them to, girls who killed their newborns, then returned to the prom. In his autobiography, he'd insist on the ultimate sanity of the artist, regardless of what he did with his life. He'd tell of his long hours of calculation and care, how when Usher's house fell into that tarn, it was a victory of precision over the loose ends of a troubled mind, how his insane narrators needed everything that was rational in him all of the time. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you, Peter and BJ.
And thank you, Lisa. Our next reader is Jim Haba. Jim was a legendary teacher at what is now known as Rowan University, but maybe more importantly for most of us, he introduced poets to thousands and thousands of people when he was the founding director of the Geraldine R. Dodge Poetry Festival. Please welcome Jim Haba.
Am I there? Yes, there I am. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, BJ, for having conceived of this and organized it. I met Stephen in 1974. I had just started teaching at what was then Glassboro State College, and as the junior member of the department, I was given the chores that no one else wanted. And one of the chores was to figure out how to spend the little bit of money that the dean had given the department for special events. And so I started the poetry series. And one of the first poets that I invited was Stephen. It was 1974, and he had just published Looking for Holes in the Ceiling. I was very excited to encourage somebody in a neighboring sister institution not too far away. And I loved his reading. I loved his poems. Just to give you an idea of those times, Stephen had an old Carmen Gia, and he had driven to Glassboro from Stockton, and he wasn't sure that the Carmen Gia would get him home. And I had a slightly newer Volkswagen, which he thought he trusted, and so he said, would you follow me home? So I did. I followed him home to make sure that he got there. And he did. And our lives crossed many times. Subsequently, he came back to read at Glassboro, and then he came to the first Dodge Poetry Festival and subsequent ones too. The most kind of enlightening experience that I had with Stephen was at the Aldebra Poetry Festival in Aldebra, England, on the southeastern coast of England in 2003. He and Barbara had come there, and Erica and I had also come there, so we were the only Americans, which was a new experience for me. And I think probably a new experience for Stephen. I'm not sure about Barbara. It wasn't a new experience for Erica, who had been to Europe many times with all kinds of people. But for me it was, and I learned what American poetry was, in a sense, from that experience, because Stephen just dazzled them with poetry made out of ordinary life, which was not something that at that point was possible, really, for the group of poets, English, British poets, who were there at that time, at that festival. And I felt that they were under the burden of Shakespeare and Pope and Milton and Chaucer, you know, on and on. And they were caught in something that Stephen was free of, and that Americans generally were free of. He was a sensation, and very, I was very proud to be an American there with him. So I'm going to read a poem of his that I love very much, published in 2011. It's called Don't Do That. It was published in Here and Now in 2011. And I like this because it catches so much of what I knew of Stephen as being at once skeptical, sarcastic, and tender, and trusting. Don't do that. It was bring your own if you wanted anything hard. So I brought Johnny Walker Red, along with some resentment I'd held in for a few weeks, which was not helped by the sight of little nameless things pierced with toothpicks on the tables, or by talk that promised to be nothing if not small. But I consented to come, and I knew what part of the house their animals would be sequestered, whose company I loved. What else can I say? Except that old retainer of slights and wrongs, that bad boy I hadn't quite outgrown. I brought him along, too. I was out to cultivate a mood. My host greeted me, but did not ask about my soul, which was when I was invited by Johnny Walker Red to find the right kind of glass and pour. I toasted the air. I said hello to the wall, then walked past a group of women dressed to be seen, undressing them one by one, and went up the stairs to where the Rottweilers were, Rosie and Tom, and got down with them on all fours. They licked the face I offered them. And I proceeded to slick back my hair with their saliva. And before long, I felt like a wild thing, ready to mess up the party, scarf the hors d'oeuvres. But the dog said, no, don't do that. Calm down. And after a while, they opened the door and let you out. They pet your head, and everything you might have held against them is gone. And you're good friends again. Stay, they say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. That was lovely. Our next reader is Dorian Lux. She's a professor at North Carolina State University and a longtime friend of Stephen's, and she has a sweet spot for Stephen's particular ability to surprise his readers. Her latest book is Only as the Day is Long, New and Selected Poems. Please welcome Dorian.
It's so wonderful to be among so many people who knew and loved Stephen. I brought him to read to NC State for our students who became besotted by him. By then he was on a cane, and when he read, his voice was so soft, you had to lean into it. A room of 100-some students seemed to stop breathing. Not a pencil dropped, not a cough. They loved him like a grandfather. They made broadsides of his poems that lined the walls, even a video or two, one of Postmortem, which Peter read earlier and that BJ is going to close with. They stood for an hour waiting for him to sign one of his many beautiful books, and he patiently and tenderly spoke to them, scrawling his name across blank page after blank page. This is his poem, Tenderness. Back then, when so much was clear, and I hadn't learned, young men learn from women, what it feels like to feel just right. I was 23, she 34, 2 children, a husband in prison for breaking someone's head. Yelled at, slapped around. All she knew of tenderness was how much she wanted it. And all I knew were back seats and a night or two in a sleeping bag in the furtive dark. We worked in the same office. banter and loneliness leading to the shared secret that to help National Biscuit sell biscuits was wildly comic, which led to my body existing with hers, like rain that's found its way underground to water it naturally joins. I can't remember ever saying the exact word, tenderness, though she did. It's a word I see now you must be older to use. You must have experienced the absence of it often enough to know what silk and deep balm it is when at last it comes. I think it was terror at first that drove me to touch her so softly, then selfishness, the clear benefit of doing something that would come back to me twofold. And finally, sometime later, it became reflexive and motiveless in the high ignorance of love. Oh, abstractions are just abstract until they have an ache in them. I met a woman, never touched gently, and when it ended between us, I had new hands and new sorrow. Everything it meant to be a man changed, unheroic, floating. Thank you. Stephen, a man of great tenderness.
Thank you, Dorian. That was lovely. Our penultimate reader, that's a word I learned from Stephen because I didn't even know how to pronounce it. Our penultimate, can't pronounce it. Penultimate reader is Barbara Daniels. And she, another longtime friend and student of Stephen's, and she and her husband, David, have been frequent dinner partners with Stephen. And Barb's latest book is Talk to the Lioness. Please welcome Barb Daniels.
Back in 1989, thanks to Mimi Schwartz, whom we heard read earlier, I was lucky enough to be a New Jersey writing fellow. Every day we had in our summer program a different person, the novelist, the essayist, and luckily for me, the poet, Stephen Dunn. Since then, my life has never been the same, and in fact, is much better. We already heard Charles Rafferty refer to something I want to mention that Stephen taught us, which is make yourself complicit. Go ahead and confess. And Charles Rafferty called this telling on himself. In the poem I'm going to read, Stephen does a little bit of that, refers to himself as faithless, and talks about the lure of the casinos that can be seen from the wildlife refuge. I'll be reading Walking the Marshland, and this takes place at Brigantine Wildlife Refuge. It was no place for the faithless, so I felt a little odd walking the marshland with my daughters. Canada geese all around, and the blue herons just standing there safe, and the abundance of swans. The girls liked saying the words gosling, egret, whooping crane, and they liked when I agreed. The casinos were a few miles to the east. I liked saying craps and croupier, and sometimes I wanted to be lost in those bright, windowless ruins. It was early April. The gnats and black flies weren't out yet. The mosquitoes hadn't risen from their stagnant pools to trouble paradise and to give us the great right to complain. I loved these girls. The world beyond Brigantine awaited their beauty, and beauty is what others want to own. I'd keep that to myself. The obvious was so sufficient just then. Sandpiper, redwing, blackbird, yes, I said, but already we were near the end. Praise refuge, I thought. Praise whatever you can. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb. And our final reader is my colleague and co-host, BJ Ward, and I'm grateful to BJ for hosting this and for Warren County College for allowing us to do that. BJ's latest book is Jack Lag Opera Collected Poems, 1990 to 2013. BJ.
Well, Peter, thank you. Thank you for doing this with me. We're both students of Stephen's who went on to become friends, and I know we're in a similar trajectory of mourning right now, but this has certainly helped. I want to give Stephen the last words. I'd like to close with his poem, which means I'm going to thank everyone now, not just Peter and Murphy Writing of Stockton University, but all of the participants. This is just a lovely, lovely reading. So thanks to Maxine Petroni, Laura McCullough, Benjamin Paloff, Kimberly Gray, Lawrence Raab, Martin Farrawell, Gerry LaFemina, Charles Rafferty, Gregory Chernikian, Penny Dugan, called in, Jim Hollis, Rob Gregg, Wanda Praisner, Christine Salvatore, Mimi Schwartz, Kathleen Graber, Brian McWilliams, Emery De Georgio, Madeline Dunninger, Mary Lisa De Dominicis, Sabaga Crystal Bacon, Lisa Honecker, Jim Haba, Dorian Lux, and Barbara Daniels. This event will be available on Warren Community College's YouTube page. I was hoping to get up on Friday, but with some of the technical glitches you've all experienced, it might take till Monday, but I'll try to get up on Friday. Yeah, you saw how the lust and good usage got made tonight. In any case, Stephen's final published book so far is Pagan Virtues, and this is the last poem in that. I should say he has one more book coming out from Norton in 2022. It's called The Not Yet Fallen World, and it's poems he selected as what he thought represented the best of his work from his whole career. It's a new and selected poems, and that there are some new poems in it, but it's not arranged chronologically. It's arranged by different concerns that the poems have. Looking forward to it, and that should be out in spring of 2022. This is Stephen's revisiting of his pretty well-known A Postmortem Guide. This is called A Postmortem Guide 2. It's dated 2018 and it has a little epigraphic note, once again, from my eulogist in advance. You, too, are 19 years older now, and no doubt will say these roughly similar words with a different sense of gravitas. I've changed, but not as much as the world has. I thought I had accepted all the troubles, which is no longer true. And rage these days has depleted that exceptional serenity I once wanted you to claim I had. Since you moved away, we've hardly spoken. And I'd understand if you feel you're now the wrong man for the job. Back then, you were the only one who knew I had an incurable disease. Well, no longer can it be hidden. I stumble and fall, shake and drool, but history's daily horror trumps any condition of mine. What is it compared to genocides and demagoguery? There will be fewer people at the service this time, perhaps a few grandchildren, maybe even a few others who've read a few of my poems. Tell them it was true. I did think I'd die at 60. In my prime, in love with mystery and its words. What I wished for you to say was sincere. Then I met a woman who chose to marry me. A man unguaranteed. A selfish man who said he'd give her 5 years. Tell them it was she who bargained for 10, then 15, and is holding out for more. Tell them everyone needs a persuasive advocate to forestall the oncoming desolations of the heart. If there are tears then, trust that you have broken through to where thoughts of me have let loose in them thoughts of opportunities they've missed, a splendor unlived. Steady your voice and tell them, even if we've known despair, it's possible with some luck and some love to wander, sometimes happily, in the despoiled and radiant now. End that way, because the whole truth, as I've tried to say before, is nothing anyone has to know. Thank you, Teach. I hope we did you proud. Thanks everyone for listening. Stephen Dunn, a tribute reading. Have a good evening.